Today is Tuesday, June 1st, 2010. My name is Frieda Reitman, and it's my pleasure to interview today Edith Sammers at her home in Stamford as part of the Oral History Archive of the Jewish Historical Society of Lower Fairfield County. I have been looking forward to this day. When did you first come to Stamford to live, and why?
We came my husband Bernie and I came in 1959, and we came because Bernie got a job with Dunlap and Associates, and we moved into Hoyt Bedford Apartments.
Now I'm going to ask you a little about your birth family, where you lived, any childhood memories, particularly any memories of Jewish experiences, just a setting. Okay. Where you live.
I grew up in Rego Park. I was born in Brooklyn, and my family and I moved with my sister to Rego Park, I think in 1941, and into a pre-war apartment. And we lived there until I ended up getting married. My sister, I guess actually my sister was not born yet because she's 5 years younger than I am. And I had a lot of friends. I went to public school, which was right across the street. There were many, many Jews in the neighborhood. I thought that almost the whole world was Jewish from my experiences at Rego Park. And then I went to Forest Hills, and Forest Hills High School, which also had many, many Jews. And interestingly, I was active already in high school with, I think I was president of B'nai B'rith Girls. We belonged to the Rego Park Jewish Center, which was a conservative synagogue and community place, as I think was fairly common in New York. And my family, we went there basically high holidays, and occasionally we went Friday night services. I had a kosher home. Grew up in a kosher home. I did not have a Jewish education. Interestingly enough, my parents, this is almost silly, but my parents said if I go to Sunday school for a year, they'll give me tickets to the circus. I could go to the circus. And we didn't have any money. We were poor, but that was a big sacrifice. And so I went for a year. And unfortunately, I was extremely bored because all you did was read the stories, and I usually was finished with it and they were still reading them. And so after a year, I begged my parents that I should not have to go again. And so they agreed because that was the deal. And in those days, they didn't teach Hebrew. I mean, to young girls, it was not the thing. So I had very little Jewish education growing up.
How about your regular education? Where did you go to school?
Well, I went to public school across the street, came home at lunchtime, which was very nice. Then I went to a junior high. I was in a special program for gifted children, so I made 3 years in 2. Then I went to Forest Hills High School, which was an outstanding academic high school, just outstanding. And from there, I went to Queens College, which also had a lot of Jews. And it was during Queens College, I went one summer to University of Wisconsin because I was studying to be a teacher. Well, my father said, he said, you must be a teacher, it's very secure. And so that's what I did, although I really wanted to be a lawyer. And I went to Wisconsin, and it was the first time I realized that Jews were a minority, because there were very few Jews there. And I took a class, I remember, in American minorities, and a young man stood up and said, well, we know that Jews own all the banks. And I had never heard anything like that before. I was like shocked. And I remember the professor said, oh, really? And he named all the banks, and of course we didn't own any of them. But it was a shock for me and a realization that we were very small in this country. But you wouldn't know that from where I went to school. And I did very well, and being a good student was absolutely paramount in my life. I had to get straight A's whenever I could, Don't know if that was good or not, but it's what motivated me, and I think, unfortunately, still does.
Did you ever encounter any anti-Semitism in that
Other than that
area?
sentence, that experience, I don't recall ever having any experience that was negative about being Jewish. Certainly not in Rego Park, Forest Hills area, and Queens College, not at all.
Now let's talk about your family. You got married, had kids. Let's hear a little bit about them and about the Jewish involvement, if any, at that point in your life.
Well, when Bernie and I came to Stanford, we did explore the various options in this town for belonging, because I always, while I wasn't religious at all, as a matter of fact, I would almost describe myself as an atheist at that point, but I was definitely a conscious Jew, a cultural Jew. I cared about the Jewish community and the Jewish people, but I didn't find religion particularly interesting at that time. And we looked at the 3 synagogues, and while I found Rabbi Ehrenkrantz fascinating, I just didn't feel comfortable being in an Orthodox synagogue. Reform at that time, Sinai didn't have the feeling tone that I was looking for, and I don't know, it was just nothing that talked to me. One of the issues that I had was I didn't like being talked at. I liked to participate and be a part of what's happening, and I couldn't find that in the 3 synagogues. For me personally, I'm not, a wallflower type person. And so we didn't belong anywhere. I missed it on the holidays, every year for the first, I would say we came in 59. I would say for the first 12 years, we used to go back sometimes to visit our parents in Queens, and we would go to synagogue there. But I would describe it almost as being lonely on the holidays. Didn't miss it every weekend because that wasn't part of my experience. And the children were, I guess, I had 3 children, one right after the other. There was actually 3 years between the oldest and the youngest. And I was beginning to feel like, how will they know they're Jewish? They had friends in the neighborhood. This was not Rego Park. This was Stanford. And a number of their friends were not Jewish. And I said, how is my home different from their home? There's nothing unique about it. There's nothing that tells them who they are or what they are. And at the same time as I was being concerned about this, I heard about a group of young Jewish families who were studying together. It wasn't a synagogue, it was just like an informal study group wanting to learn about religions, one of them being Jewish. And so I got involved with it, and ultimately it evolved into what was then the Fellowship for Jewish Learning. And I began to study with Mark Olive. We employed him. He was a young rabbi. He actually wasn't even ordained yet, and I went to his ordination at Temple Emmanuel in New York. I had a real aha. It was like I started to learn that Judaism is not the Bible, it's not the Torah. It's what the rabbis say the Torah is saying to you. And so as a young girl, when I remember that year that I was bored, reading these silly stories and the Red Sea splitting and this and that, and thinking how silly it all was, I didn't know what it was really teaching, because that's not how you were taught when you were in Sunday school. And so I just had a total evolution. When I first met him, and he still quotes me to this day, I asked him if I could be Jewish if I didn't believe in God, or if I was an atheist. And his response to me, of course, was, of course you can, but don't tell me what you believe in. Tell me what you do as a person, and I'll tell you what you believe in. And from that point on, it has been an unbelievable journey for me. I have been studying with him and other places since 1973. And I still go to study, we still study. The Havara, which when we split, we became the Havara Eitzayim, has been, I would say, an essential part of my life since 1973. And for my children, they did not go to the day school, although I considered it, but because I was a public school teacher in Stanford, I felt that it wasn't the right message. Somehow, how could I be teaching in public school and my children be going to private school? That didn't seem right to me. If I look back now, it probably was a little bit silly, but because I was talking about a Jewish school, but they didn't. They went to public school. They love the Havara. It wasn't an intense Jewish education at all. However, what it did was it opened them up to the experience of wanting to learn more. And my daughter, I don't know if you want me to go into it, but my daughter has evolved she observes Shabbat. She spent many, many, many years in Israel. She's very committed to the Jewish people and to Jewish life. And it wasn't because she had an intense Jewish education, but I think she felt happy with whatever she was learning and experience. We did a lot of singing. It was just terrific. And Bill, now he was a lawyer, but he left law and he went into Jewish social service, and now is a vice president of the New York Federation in charge of their planned giving. My son Michael is the only one of the three, because he went to school away, I think, that didn't absorb the Jewish milieu, the Jewish life that we lived in this house. So he's kind of a little different. He's not part of what he likes the values, but forget anything having to do with religion.
2 out of 3 is pretty.
No, good. I know.
Did they ever report any discrimination in their in the Stanford
I don't think
community?
Audrey or Bill did. I don't remember it. I think Michael probably experienced it when he went to high school in Maine, Hebron, and I think there probably was somewhat, although he did I don't remember it vividly as something that was an issue for any of them at all. So that was good.
Now I want to talk about you.
Okay.
Your career choices after college and so forth, how you moved through that.
Well, I'm now, I think, in my 4th career. I studied education. I started teaching because I was married in college. Bernie and I was at the end of my junior year when we got married. That was late for that time, actually. Most of my friends were already married. And I finished a year student teaching and finishing up college. And then I came to Stanford because he took his first job here. And I got a job teaching in the Stanford Public Schools, which was an interesting experience because my student teaching experience at Queens was with a very progressive, open type of classroom, exciting, dynamic. And I started teaching in Stanford and I almost passed out. I mean, I don't know, I can't think of another word to use to describe the Stanford school system at that time. This was 1959, and it was, compared to what I had left in Rego Park, Queens, it was like archaic. But I did what I could. I taught at Willard School, which is now a senior citizen home, and I taught there for, I guess, 2.5 years. And then I got pregnant and you had to retire at the end of 5 months. Even if you weren't even showing, which I wasn't. I had a child. That child was a Down syndrome child. And at that time, both Bernie and I decided that we would not take her home. And I was told by Rabbi Ehrenkrantz, who did visit me in the hospital, and a couple of other, Dr. Danoff, who had just started, that of all the places, if you were going to have a child like that, Connecticut was one of the best places in the United States because they had a very good program. And so we placed her in a home, and she was subsequently adopted. I went back to teaching and taught for another 2 years, and then Audrey was born. So then I stayed home for, I guess it was 9 years, from 1964 to 1973, and then decided, I looked and I thought about doing what I really wanted to originally do, which was to be a lawyer. But there wasn't a very good program in the area that I could manage with 3 kids. I had Audrey, and then 15 months later I had Michael. And then Bill 2 years later. So I decided to go back to teaching. And it turned out that a very great opportunity happened just in the year that I was going back in '73. There was a program that had just started in the Stanford Public Schools called Project Explore, which was a program for gifted children. And I applied for one of the positions that had opened up, and I got the job, and I stayed with that for 7 years, and it was a very exciting program. It was definitely made for me. I felt like I was right for these children. I wasn't scared of them. They didn't make me nervous. I loved it. I loved their questions. I loved the dynamics of working with these children. And I did it for 7 years. However, I was very interested in administration, and at that time the Stanford school system was not, I don't know how it is today, but it wasn't open to anybody who I was kind of questioning, dynamic, exciting, strong women. And so I went for a 6th year. I had to go for a master's while I was teaching, but I went for a 6th year in administration, and I still could not get a job. So I decided to go to business school. And in 1976, I went to business school, University of Connecticut. It was a very good program. I went at night. I was probably the only woman there who had children, who was working as a teacher, working full-time, I should say, and taking an MBA. Most of the people there did 2 of those 3. And I managed it. I don't know, my children, I think, managed to survive that period of time. And in the 1980, a gentleman by the name of Herb Spira, who was a professor there, had heard about a program that was starting a new business. It was a big secret, and would I be interested? It was not a long-term job. It was a short project of 6 months, and I said, why not? And I was thinking of my father, who was so concerned, grew up in the Depression, and was so concerned about security, and here I was going to give up my teaching job. I was on tenure at that point. I had been back now. It's 10 years altogether. But I decided that it was now or never. And so I took this job. It was with CBS. I finally found out after I interviewed. And it was to look at what we now know as the internet. So this was 1980. They were exploring what was called video text. And what got me interested in is I kept thinking I hated shopping, food shopping. And here I could see they showed this make-believe example of shopping online. And I said, that's for me. And so I joined this task force for 6 months. And we explored, it wasn't real, but we explored all different ways of putting various programs on the computer And I did that for 6 months, and then I went to Sony Corporation, who was looking at developing equipment and working with software, and I did that. And then I went to Chase, Manhattan Bank, and worked with home banking, which to this day I still do and love. It's like the best thing since sliced bread. Developed a whole home banking, I mean, I wasn't in charge of the whole project, but I was in charge of what I would call the user interface, which is, what does the person using it see? How does it work for them? Do they understand it? And I think my experience with teaching and trying to see how the child feels from the other side helped me in that whole approach. So I'm always thinking the user, how does the user see something? And then from Chase, I went to follow somebody who liked me very much, and he became president of a small company called Comtex, and it was in Stanford. And I had been commuting at that point to New Jersey and Long Island, and I went to work there. And then they moved to Virginia, and then I had to make some decisions. Did I want to continue? I decided I'll try a little more, and I went to work for something called the Chamber World Network, which was a German company that was based in Asia, and they were interested in taking Asian newspapers and putting them online that were in English, but news about Asia, so that various corporations could get them. And so I was in the marketing of that, and worked with a lot of big companies and did a lot of stuff. But what was happening was the internet was developing, and it was beginning to become advertiser supported, like television. And I said, I don't really want to sell advertising. I liked working with information. I liked selling information, marketing it. And so I made a career decision. Bernie had switched careers from engineering and management consulting, because after he was president of the Federation, Jewish Federation in Stanford, which he loved, I encouraged him to think about switching careers, and so he did. And he switched very successfully into nonprofit, and he became head of first he worked for Technion, and then he headed up the American Committee for the Weizmann Institute of Science, and it was a perfect wedding for him because of his science background in administration, and I just loved it. And it inspired me. And I said, it's really meaningful. It does take my strength of administration and my love of the Jewish people, and I thought it would be a beautiful blend. And so I decided to switch to nonprofit, and I had one job in New York, which was for the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation, but it didn't really connect to that. Even though it appears to be a Jewish disease more than any other, it didn't talk to me as much. And then the opportunity opened up at the Federation. I happened to have been on the board of Federation when they had an opening for Director of Development, and I spoke with Sheila Romanowitz, and I interviewed. I went through the channels, and I got the job. And then Sheila subsequently told me she was leaving like in a year. I was like really upset. And then I decided, do I want to try for this? Do I want to do her job? Because it's a really big job. It takes a lot of time and energy. And I'm trying to think, this was 1993, I believe. And I think at that time, Bernie had already died. Bernie had died. And did I want to give my whole life at this point to my work? And I decided to switch, and I decided to take that job. And it was offered to me again. I went through the interview channels and everything else. And I did that, I think it was 6 or 7 years. It was how I met Ed, my current husband, my wonderful husband, because I asked him to, I didn't know him at all, and I asked, needed somebody to work on the database, and he had newly sold Silmay stores, and so he came to work as a volunteer, which he's still doing, even though I've left. And I did that for 6 or 7 years, and then I decided, since we were newly married, it was taking way too much time and meetings and nights and everything, and so I decided to retire. And I thought I was really retiring, and I would go back to a life of lay leadership, because I can never sit quietly and just read a book. Never. And then I learned that my rabbi, Mark Golub, who has been in media since 1979 with L'Chaim, which was a television program, was going to become involved in starting a Jewish network. And I said to myself, this is another whole field. I know nothing about television, but I know about the Jewish community. And I had made a lot of contacts over my lifetime. And I thought, and I had marketing, and I thought, gee, maybe I could help him. And so I suggested if he wanted somebody to help, I wasn't going to work for nothing, but I would be happy to work, for a reasonable amount of money. And he took me up on the offer, and I think it's now 3.5 years, maybe 4, that I've been working with him on Shalom TV. And it's been a wonderful experience. So I don't know, what did I leave out? I left out, one thing I left out, which I think is important, and it's something people should know, and it's not Jewish, but I think I mentioned that the Stanford Public Schools were somewhat distressing to me. And my children were now going. And Audrey, who was reading when she went into kindergarten, was being taught the alphabet. And I went in to see this new teacher, it was her first year, and I said to her, I think you need some help. And she said, yes, I do, because I don't know how to handle all the different levels of children in my classroom. And so I went to see the principal, who I will not mention his name because this is on tape. And I said, this teacher that Audrey has needs your help. She needs some support. And the answer I got from this gentleman was, I can't help her, or I'm not going to, something to that effect. And I walked out, and I said, I have to do something about this. This is not acceptable. And so Adele Gordon and I started Quest, which was a organization, Quality Education for Stanford. And we worked I wasn't working at this point. This was when the children were, before I had gone back. I was taking a master's, but it was before I went back to work, back to teaching. And we used to have workshops for teachers. We got volunteer professors, and we did it all over Stanford, and they ended up doing a staff development program in Stanford Public Schools. It was the time of the open classroom was starting, and it did really make some change. And I think if you want to get change in a bureaucracy, which education is, it has to come from the outside. It's so hard from the inside. Change is very difficult. And it needs something, people caring enough. And so my sense is, what I've learned is that if you really care about something, whether it be Jewish, which in my case is basically my whole life at this point, if you care about something, it's not going to happen, and you want to see something done, it's not going to happen if you let the other guy. And that takes me sort of full circle to what I learned about the splitting of the Red Sea. Because one of the first beautiful experiences I had when Nachshon, when the concept of the splitting of the Red Sea was that it split, as the rabbis say. And whether it's true or not doesn't matter. When somebody went into the water, either up to his nose or whatever, because he took a step, because he didn't wait for others to do, and he didn't wait for miracles to happen because he was responsible. And it was like a real aha for me. And it was a beautiful lesson. And I think it's what I always knew from my parents, from my mother and my father, but it wasn't identified that that was a Jewish value. It was just my parents' value. So because of that, I think I continue to feel that if you want to see something happen, you have to be responsible for it. So that's my story. I'm sorry I went on so long.
I think it's wonderful to have this recorded. That's great, and you speak beautifully. You probably left out a few things. Some leisure things you did that were also
You mean
Jewish.
fun?
No, I was thinking.
Oh, well, I do a lot of things as
That's-
a volunteer, Jewishly. I was president of the, also in the 1960s when my children were young, and how I met people before the Havara started, which I have a whole group of wonderful friends from. I joined Hadassah. Now, you have to understand, my parents never did anything Jewish except go to synagogue once or twice a year.
And have a kosher home.
And have a kosher home. But my mom was not involved. First of all, she went to work. She worked. So nobody did anything in the Jewish community. They weren't lay leaders, as we use the term. But I guess I was somewhere in my head. So I joined Hadassah, and I guess that was in the first year I came, 1959. And became very active, very involved, and ultimately became president, I guess it was 1969, of Gladys Ailes Hadassah. Loved every minute of it. Also was involved in 1973 with Bernie in the initial group that started Federation in Stamford, which is when the UJA, Bob Schreiber, who Bernie worked with, was very involved with UJA, and Bernie got involved because we took a trip with Hadassah to Israel. We took that trip in 1969, and we almost stayed. I came there, and it was a very exciting time because it was right after the war, 67 war, and I was there and I said to Bernie, you know, it really matters that we're here. It would make a difference if we stayed. I don't know that it makes a difference whether I'm back in the United States or not, but I know me, Edith, could make a real contribution to Israel. But we were a little too middle class in the sense of walking away from family and friends, and so we didn't. We were back many, many times, and so I came back. We got involved in starting Federation in 1973. Bernie was president. He was the third president after Bob Schreiber. He became totally involved and committed to Jewish life later than I did because I was already involved. And so I was on the board. I'm now, and one thing I should say, if we're going to have a strong Jewish community in this country, we have to focus on Jewish education. I'm not saying we shouldn't care for the underdog. I'm not saying we shouldn't have do good social deeds. But if we don't educate our young people and the parents of children who have young children, nobody is going to understand in this country what Jewish is. And ultimately, I think it will just disappear because nobody will see the difference between the next door neighbor and themselves. And I think there is a difference. Not saying it's better, but I think that there are values that are worth keeping. So after I retired, I'm trying to think of all the things I did, but after I retired from Federation, from my job at Federation, I am now very involved in Jewish education. I'm on the Center for Judaic Studies. I'm on, I was very involved in starting Kulanu because I felt that we needed a strong Jewish education for our teens before they went off to college. I'm on the Board of Jewish Education, and in the spirit of helping the underdog, I'm also on the Board of Jewish Family Service, which is, you know, the core of Jewish values. But if we're going to keep that core of Jewish values, we have to educate. And so that's what I do. And other than that, I'm trying to think, what do? I'm in a book group. I was in a Jewish book group in Hadassah many, many years ago. Now it's just a plain ordinary book group. I played tennis since I was 5. I've given that up. Don't think it's good to play tennis.
I was looking, but I knew you were involved in all sorts of things that you hadn't yet mentioned. So
well, you know, I did play tennis for many, many years, and I love the sport. My dad taught it to me because he played tennis in New York City, of all places. But you know, you get to a certain stage, and subsequently, it turns out, with all of this, probably maybe because of all of this, I developed heart disease, and I had 2 stents, a stent put in, I guess it'll be 2 years ago, and so now I am a dedicated exerciser, and I go 5 days a week to the Jewish Center, which I think, by the way, is also a very important institution in this community, and that's what I do basically in my spare time. Other than that, I do mostly Jewish. I mean, it's absolutely the core of who I am. I can't even explain how it's in my genes.
That's true, I'm sure. And I was wondering if you'd want to reflect a little on the characteristics of the parts of the Jewish community that you have observed, whether you would like to. And I'm not sure about that, but your
I can
comments,
say some
you
things.
made some comments about education in
Right.
the public sector, and I wonder if you have any comments.
Jewish education is critical. In this community, because of my work as head of, when I was doing Federation, I came in contact with a lot of other communities across the country. This is a good Jewish community. It has a lot of enrichment, a lot of wonderful things. However, I think from its economic perspective, it is also a relatively wealthy Jewish community. That doesn't mean everybody in it is rich, but it is compared to other Jewish communities. It is not, and I hesitate to say this on tape, it is not as charitable as it should be. I don't know why. I think it's a symptom of, interestingly enough, of the Northeast in general. The statistics are kind of amazing. Connecticut, for example, is up near the top in this is not just Jewish, per capita income, and it's one of the very lowest in per capita giving. And I don't know exactly why. I don't know if it's because we're on the East Coast and we can escape whenever we want. I'm not sure. No. The Midwest is, now I'm talking Jewish, the Midwest communities are by far more cohesive, more caring. The hardest thing for people to do is to give money. They give their money. They can give their time. They can give their verbal commitment, or oral commitment, that they care, and that's important. They can march. But to give up money, your own money, so that you maybe have a little less to spend on yourself, is very, very hard. It's something I learned from my husband, Bernie, who did a lot of fundraising in his life. And I find that there is a segment of that in this community, which saddens me. And I don't know exactly why it is, but it is the way it is. So those are, you know, if there's one little negative, on the other hand, there are so many activities. You could be busy every night in this community doing something Jewish. And that's important. I remember when they were having a march in Washington, which trying to remember, we've had so many marches. I don't know if this, well, the Soviet Jewry thing was unbelievable. But I think during the Intifada, when things were really getting bad for Israel, I organized and we had 5 buses that came from here to go to Washington, D.C. And I felt very good about that. At least people were aware of the fact that there was a need for them to do something, to put their foot in the water. But fundraising has always been a challenge in this community. And it may be true for not just Jewish.
I'm wondering if it isn't.
I think it's probably generally true. It's the way it is here.
Now, you had said that you wanted to video some special items.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Should I? This was just a very nice plaque that I got from Gladys Ailes' group of Hadassah when I retired as president. And I don't know if I should read it, but it said, the Gladys Ailes group of Hadassah honors Edith Sammers for her dedicated leadership, intellectual insight, and administrative ability as president. She has fostered the ideals of the Jewish heritage by her commitment to the healing, teaching, and research efforts of Hadassah. And I was very proud of that. I should mention that one of the contributions I made was
there something else you wanted to?
Yes, this one from, and this was from my staff and from UJF when I retired. Actually, it's from the staff of UJF and JCF, which was Jewish Community Endowment Foundation, because I worked very closely. And that was, Edith, thank you for your leadership, guidance, and generosity of spirit. And that was when I retired as Executive Vice President of the Federation in Stanford. What I was going to say, one of the things that I accomplished in Hadassah, because I wasn't at that point affiliated, and I don't even believe I had a kosher home at that time. I did change my home to kosher as a result of learning. I said that Hadassah had to have, whenever they had a function, they had to be kosher. It had to be inclusive so that everybody could come and that nobody would be excluded. And that was one thing I accomplished. I don't know if they're still doing it, but they did then. They started doing that, and I felt very good about it. So, you know, I started different little things that were important. I remember, and you probably know this, whenever you got an invitation, it would say $20 or $50 a couple. And I remember pointing out that that was not a good idea, because there were people out there who were single, and you immediately assume that everybody's coming as couples. And so now I think generally most organizations say per person. So, you know, those are little things, but they're examples of ways you can make life better. And my friends will tell you that I'm always trying to improve things. Like I'm not satisfied. It's not that I'm not satisfied, I just think that life can be better. And you have to work at it. Either, whether Jewish, non-Jewish, traffic, which I didn't even mention, which I'm always trying to improve. And I have done things in this town. So, I don't know, I feel very good about my life. And I feel like I wanted it to make a difference that I was here. And I guess that's always guiding me. That it matters that I lived and that, you know, that I accomplished something in my life. One of these days I'll lie down and read a book.
Well, I'm glad we have this on tape so that other people can learn who haven't had an opportunity to meet you and to see what you've done firsthand will someday know about you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've enjoyed your questions and talking with you.